Now tell me I'm a chef again. practicing that. Neander time and time.